came out of nowhere. It was not even expected. It is the greatest assault on the church.
Yep.
Greater than the Muslims. Greater than the Protestants. Called the Age of Science. It started up in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. It was called the Renaissance. And by the 17th century, it had another name.
Cool.
The name was the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was attached to a new economy, which, utilizing the power of money and mobilizing money, created a dynamic economic system that we call capitalism. And at the heart of capitalism was not an interest in the next life, it was an interest in this life, where the primary ritual of the church was prayer. The primary ritual of capitalism was shopping. And now you will find many, many people on Sunday morning, instead of going to church, they are what? We are now into the beginnings of the consumer culture, and that will totally transform people's focus. The age of science and the age of shopping will enable people to feel empowered. And once they feel empowered, their focus will move from the next life to this one. And in fact, that assault was to be almost fatal to the church. The church was used to enemies. Enemies are people who hate you. The Muslims hated them. The Protestants hated them. The worst thing that can happen in life is not hate. It's indifference. I don't care. I'm so busy exercising, shopping, or whatever else, I have no time. That's fatal, you understand. That's worse than hate. You understand, means you're important. Indifference means you're not important. The church had never confronted that kind of enemy. The Pope had never confronted that kind of an enemy. And in fact, in the 17th and 18th century, there now appeared all kinds of figures who basically said the church was irrelevant. And that was expressed by an event at the end of the 18th century called the French Revolution, which drove the Pope almost insane. He ended up as the prisoner of the leader of the revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte. And the ultimate insult to the Pope was that the French Revolution decreed the separation of religion and government. Religion was so unimportant that you could either do it or not do it. And now there appeared not only the enemy, Protestants and Muslims, there now appeared people who, if you ask them, are you Catholic? They say, yes, I'm Catholic. But I can't go to church because I play golf. Yes, I'm Catholic, you understand, but I have to what? I have a shot. So they're called secular. They're secularized. They are the beginning of what we call indifference. So that means it's not that people are coming to burn down the church. They don't show up. How do you deal with this enemy? break your stained glass windows and whatever. There are people who say, I have other places to go. Thank you. So who's going to pay for the lights? Who's going to pay for the bill? I mean, the whole establishment. It was a crisis greater than any crisis the church had ever confronted before. It is still confronting, do you understand, that crisis. So, the Pope now had to figure out how to respond to it. So let me try to describe the response. The first response is called defiance. So, the great Pope of defiance was Pius IX. He lived in the middle of the 19th century, and what he said was, if you don't do what I tell you to do, I will excommunicate you. How dare you treat us with indifference? The ultimate sign of Pius IX was that in 1870, while the Italians were trying to get their act together and unite as a nation, he calls a council in Rome in which all the bishops vote to declare that the Pope is infallible. Well, that doesn't seem to persuade the Italian army from taking Rome and taking most of his property. Ultimately, he ends up as a prisoner in the Vatican. So that strategy didn't really seem to work. And the number of Italians who are not interested in the church increases. So then comes Pius X. He's at the beginning of the 20th century. And he calls a big meeting and he announces what he calls the enemy. The enemy is called modernism. And he says there are certain books you can't read. Now, you know the moment you announce. That's the best advertising. The best advertising for a book in a free society is what? Banned! So now he has this long list of books you may not read, and now he lists all the ideas that are part of modernism which you may not endorse. Democracy. Well, that's a popular thing. Liberalism. Liberalism is personal freedom. Personal freedom leads to chaos, he said. People make the wrong choices. Instead of going to church, they play golf. So personal freedom may not be what? The best thing. And he also assaults the ideas of modern science, including evolution. Okay. Well, there's a long list. I can't go over the whole list. It's a very long list. There's things you are not supposed to endorse, participate in, whatever. So, what was the effect of all of this? All the books that were banned, only more people what? Bought them, and democracy only expands, and liberalism only is more popular. Even condemns capitalism, only that's what? Expanding and growing. So, Pius X didn't work. Then we get to a pope that I remember when I was a child. His name was Pius XI. And Pius XI now decides that he will make a deal with the movement that has arisen in Italy that wants to establish patriotism. In Italian power, the name of the movement is fascism. And in 1929, he makes a deal with Mussolini whereby Mussolini says, if you recognize the legitimacy of my regime, I will allow priests into the schools to teach. And in fact, Pius XI was followed in 1939 by the Pope, who was the Pope during World War II. His name was Pius XII. And Pius XII maintained that alliance, since he also regarded the alliance as useful against his great enemy. The great enemy was the Bolshevik world, the communist world. So, the problem was that Mussolini's side lost the war. You get Clara Petacci or hung up. Milano, well, it's over. His ally Adolf Hitler is what? Defeated. And the communist Russian armies have reached the middle of Europe. So Pius XII then chooses another strategy to boost the church, to get people to come, called anti-communism. We have an enemy, a vicious and terrible enemy, and indeed they were vicious and terrible. They were the what? I mean, who knows Stalin and who knows what? So now he organizes political parties in Italy and in France. They're called the Christian Democratic parties, and also in West Germany. And their role is to what? To fight the communists. And in fact, for a while it holds, even in America. In the 1950s, during the heyday of the resistance to communism, there was a kind of revival of interest in Catholicism. Remember Thomas Merton? You remember? And there was the figure of Fulton J. Sheen on television and whatever, the kind of revival. Well, by the 1960s, Pius XII had died, and in fact, the anti-communist movement was fizzling in North America and also in Europe. So now comes the second strategy. What was happening during all this time was, despite all these strategies, the number of people attending Mass is what? Shrinking. It is the inevitable consequence of being exposed to the new world of capitalism and science. Like relentless, it's shrinking. No matter what they have chosen to do, it's not working. So then, after Pius XII, they can't figure out who to choose as the Pope. They choose a man, an old man, who they think is dying, until they can figure out what to do. His name is John the 23rd, and he chooses another strategy. It is the setting for what we would call the present Pope. John the 23rd decides not on the strategy of defiance, but the strategy of accommodation. The strategy of accommodation says, look, this is the world the way it is. The world filled with what? Science and shopping and whatever else it is, and personal freedom. That's where it is. We can fight it all we want. We're not going to win. So instead of being the bad parent all the time, saying, hollering, stop it, don't do this, why don't we be the nice parent? Hello. Don't get excited. You're all right. The church understands you. And that produced a council called Vatican Council II, where the Pope appears and announces, I welcome all your opinions. What kind of a church is this? Please share. Thank you for sharing. sharing. Where was the thank you for sharing? That was the thank you. All this strategy. People were telling us to populate. And in fact, out of it came almost revolutionary change. It didn't happen because the church wanted it necessarily. It happened because you could see the handwriting on the wall. Unless something was changed, the numbers would continue to shrink. But by shrink, I don't mean that people said they weren't Catholic. You ask people, what are you? Everybody has to have a label. A Catholic, Buddhism, you got to have a label. You can't say, I don't have a label. Very, it's nerve-wracking. Got to give them a name. Right? But that doesn't mean anything. You can be, if you're Catholic and never go to Mass, if you're Jewish and you never go to a Jewish event, but I mean, you know. So, now the idea was, if we make it consumer friendly, how do we make it consumer friendly? Well, up until now, the language of God was Latin. So when you showed up at church, you spoke to God. He speaks Latin. You may or may not understand what the priest is saying, and he doesn't face you, he faces the altar, he faces God. And you're allowed to listen. So now it's consumer friendly. Now you turn the priest around. And he faces you, and he doesn't speak Latin to you, he now speaks the language you understand. English, French, Italian, whatever else it is, the whole thing. And now we're going to sing songs, and maybe we'll even bring a guitarist into them. The whole response, the defiance response is, shut up and listen. The consumer-friendly response is, be here, please. We want you to understand. We want you to. It's a different response. And it's all part of one of the things that comes with capitalism. I want to tell you, it's one of the most powerful strategies. It has changed the approach of all religious movements, including the fundamentalists, called marketing. Do you understand what that means? When your customer comes into the store, you don't say, take off your galoshes. You say, whoa, I'm so glad to see you. Like a cup of coffee. It's accommodation. Marketing is something, do you understand? That came out of what we call the capitalistic world. Even the Lubavitchers know marketing. They're the Hasidic people. I mean, they wait out. Hi, everybody, just come on in, have a cup of coffee. So therefore it's revolutionary. The church decides to accommodate itself, you understand? And in fact, now the church says to people, a lot of Catholics who live in this new mixed world where people are moving around is now beginning of a global economy. They've married Protestants, who knows what, Jews, etc., etc. And now, in this consumer-friendly society, we don't say to other people, your path is false. He said, we have something to learn from. So now we have dialogue. It's a revolution. The Pope will talk to Protestants. The Pope will talk to Jews. The Pope will even talk to Muslims, whatever else it is. We're going to have a dialogue. That's wonderful. And the final and ultimate thing that was done at Vatican Council, too, because you're now dealing with what we call a shopping culture. Shopping culture is I am me, I am in charge of my life, and I will choose whom I will marry, where I will work, what I will do. So now, what you say to people is, look, one of the ways you make your moral decisions is to listen to your own personal conscience. Is that consumer conscience? It's up to you. Does that mean that if I have to decide on birth control, and the Pope says no, and my conscience says yes, that I follow my conscience? By the way, the chaotic implications of this concession are what? Absolutely overwhelming. But it was intended as a way to what? We're a nice, non-authoritarian organization. And in fact, John the 23rd is remembered with great what? Love and respect. But the point is, he dies in the middle of the whole conference. And he's followed by a man, Montini, who takes the name Paul VI. And Paul VI now enters into what we call the debate. The debate begins almost immediately. It begins with a loud Catholic cry. Boy. What did we do? What? We've opened the door to chaos. This organization is going to fall apart. And in fact, the debate is still going. Was Vatican Council too good or bad? The ultimate test would be that more and more Catholics come back to the church. But the evidence is that despite Vatican Council II, the number of people attending Mass in Europe and in North America continues to shrink. So the other side said, you made all these concessions, do you understand? You learned all these marketing skills, you were not consumer friendly, and what's happening? They're not showing up. And one of the reasons is you undermine the authority of a pope. You say to people, it's up to you. Up to you. So now there is a group of people who are determined to stop it. If we continue down this road, we won't have any church. We will have a bunch of individuals who may or may not show up. It's better to have a smaller church that's disciplined than a bigger one that's just a mush. Now, Paul VI belongs to the following group. There were those people who thought the council was wonderful. There were those people who thought the council was horrible. And then there were those people who were neither here nor there. They're called the ambivalent. On Monday they thought it was wonderful. On Tuesday they thought it was terrible. On Wednesday they thought it was wonderful. On Thursday they thought it was terrible. So he was torn. However, when he dies in 1978, he is replaced by a man whose opinions we're not sure of because he didn't last. Remember John Paul I? Come on. And then he was over. He's followed by the most charismatic pope that maybe existed in the history of the papacy. He was the Polish Archbishop of Krakow. His name was Karol Wojtyła, and he took the name John Paul II out of courtesy to the one who just died. All right? So he's John Paul II, and from 1978 until 2005, he will now lead the church. John Paul II did not like Vatican Council II. But the church has a problem. Since John the 23rd, who was the deputy of God, endorsed it, John Paul II can't say it was wrong. He can't do that. The Pope is infallible. So did Paul VI. So the only way to do it is you pay homage to Vatican Council II, but you tighten the screws. And so what John Paul II needed was a man to tighten the screws. So now let me mention who this person is. His name is Joseph Ratzinger, and I'll give you the story very briefly. He was born in Bavaria in Germany in 1927. April of 1927. So he is presently 79 years old. He was born in a little town called Marketable am Inn, and then he moved to a place called Traunstein, where he sort of grew up. His family was devoutly Catholic. His father was a policeman. His mother had been a barmaid. They were very pious people. And when he was only 6 years old, a man by the name of Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. From the beginning of his life, he wanted to be a priest. At the age of 5, he told his mother he wanted to be a cardinal. Very unusual. Most people at 5 want to be a fireman. No, he's very smart, and very focused. And the family had trouble with Hitler, as did the leaders of the Catholic Church. Leaders of the Catholic Church often supported Hitler simply because of the two choices, fascism or communism. Fascism seemed to be the lesser of the two evils. However, his father, who was a policeman, was moved from place to place because he didn't like the Nazi regime. He didn't like the Nazi regime because the Nazi regime was hostile to Catholic education. They wanted the kids to have Nazi education, not Catholic education. And that meant taking the kids out of Catholic schools and putting them into Nazi schools, and that was a big bone of contention. So this family remains very ambivalent and even hostile to Adolf. However, in 1943, little Joseph, is recruited along the way for the Hitler Youth, and also to do work for the German army. All the kids were running out of soldiers. Later on, he shipped off to the border of Hungary to Austria in order to build defenses against the advancing Red Army. So he's like in the German army. When the war is over, he is released, and the person he wants to become is a priest. He's always wanted to be a priest. So he goes to seminary in Traunstein, and he's one of the brightest kids that ever showed up in Traunstein for the priesthood. He ultimately will be sent to pursue his doctorate. In 1951, he will become a priest. And then when he graduates with his doctorate, in 1953, he'll go off to be a teacher. He's so smart, he becomes a teacher of theology. First he goes to the University of Bonn, then he goes to the University of Munster. These are all Catholic colleges. And then he will go down to one of the most famous colleges, the University of Tübingen, southern Germany, where he will be an important faculty person. He arrives there in the mid-60s when all hell breaks loose among the students. Remember the 60s? Up until this time, he was viewed as a kind of liberal. But his experience at Tübingen with the students, who were so radical, they were seizing buildings, and they were demonstrating, and they were interrupting professors' lectures or whatever. He saw their movement as chaotic. He ultimately left Tübingen because he could see the danger of all this chaos. And he went to live in a place called Regensburg, which is on the Danube River, where he became a professor of theology and also the vice president of a college, and became now one of the leading voices for the conservative side. He had been at Vatican Council II, where he had been viewed as a liberal. But by the end of the 1960s, he was viewed as a conservative. And Paul VI appoints him ultimately to be the Archbishop of Munich. That's a pretty big, it's a pretty big job. He is rising in the hierarchy, and that's where he is when Paul VI dies. By then, he's even a cardinal. And he participates in the election of John Paul I, who only lasts for a long time. And then he participates in the election of John Paul II, who we know who he voted for, of course not. Can we imagine who he voted for? He may have voted for John Paul II. So in 1978, John Paul II becomes the Pope. He's opposed basically to the ideology of Vatican Council II. He's looking for somebody to tighten the screws. By now, Ratzinger has presented himself as a person also who's very concerned about the chaos that has emerged from Vatican Council II and is in favor of tightening the screws. So, in 1981 and 82, John Paul II invites him to become a member of his cabinet. Pope is a king. He has a cabinet. It's called a curia. The Secretary of State, the most important job. There are two very important jobs. One is the foreign minister, who's called the Secretary of State. He's the one who deals with all the countries outside and all the issues. The other job, which is of equal importance, used to be called the Holy Office. The other name for the Holy Office was the Inquisition. The purpose of the Inquisition is to make sure that in the church there is purity of doctrine and belief. No chaos. Now, since the word Inquisition had become consumer-wise, it's not a good marketing. You walk into a room and say, I am the Grand Inquisitor. You understand? It's not a good marketing. You can't do that. So it's the same job, but they changed it. He is now the head of what is called the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, which is sort of innocuous. And he now becomes a major figure in the Pope's cabinet. And his job is to what? Tighten the screws, which he does. There are all kinds of academicians who love Vatican Council II who lose their job. One of them, one of the most famous ones, is Hans Kuhn, who was a co-professor within the Vatican, one of the liberals, and one of them who loses his job at Catholic University in Washington. His name is Curran, Father Curran, C-U-R-R-A-N. He loses his job. He's not teaching at Southern Methodist in Texas. So, bit by bit, the people are removed who won't cooperate. What we need to do is to return to the discipline of the old, and Ratzinger is very clear. We may talk to Protestants and Jews and Muslims and whatever, but we have the true message. And in fact, to suggest otherwise is to deviate from the purity of the faith. So the Pope actually gives him lots of jobs. They're a good team. The Pope has a wonderful strategy for success. His strategy is not to appear as an inquisitor. His strategy, because he has a charismatic personality, is basically to go out and, this is one of the marketing strategies, learn from capitalism. Call it a media spread. I want to tell you, the religious right, Protestant fundamentals in this country know that. first media star was a man called Billy Graham. Now, that's a new strategy. Before they used to have scowling clergymen say, "No, stop!" Now you've got what? People smiling and friendly and whatever else it is. So he becomes the greatest media religious star in the world. The only person coming close to him was a man from Tibet called the Dalai Lama. I mean, Protestants came, all kinds of people went to hear him. You understand? He learned that secret, and that was very effective. Because while you're tightening the screws, you're also what? Being extremely personable and loving, and that was part of his nature. So, they were a good team. Ratzinger did tightening the screws, and John Paul II went out to do the work, meet the public. He also chose to be a political figure. There's no doubt about it. In his native Poland, he helped to bring down the communist government. He was overwhelmingly successful. Could Ratzinger imitate his style? The answer is no. He may have taken a course. It wasn't Ratzinger. Could Ratzinger read a book in an hour of 600 pages, summarize it for you, and then enforce it? Got this team? Very clever. We call the team of Otiwa and Ratzinger. Wonderful. It was a wonderful team. And then John Paul II grew sick and died. There's no doubt who he wanted as his successor. He did not want somebody who, like Vatican Council II, by then almost all the cardinals in the College of Cardinals who would vote for the next pope had been appointed for him and were on the conservative side. And the sign that he was for Ratzinger as his successor is that he appointed him ultimately the dean of the College of Cardinals, who put him in charge of the whole process of electing somebody new when he died in 2005. So, I remember the paper that all it might be this, it might be this, it might be him, it might be. But the main man at the Pope's funeral was Ratzinger. Gave the main eulogy, the whole thing, he was a central figure. So he was elected very quickly, and he now has to choose a name. So, there had never been a Pope Joseph. So he chose the name of a very famous man who founded the Benedictine order of monks. He was a missionary, and he sees himself as a missionary for the defense of the faith. So he took the name Benedict. And he became Benedict the 16th. Well, the question was, would he continue to tighten the screws? Some people said that if you tighten the screws, the church will become more attractive, and you will increase the number of people. And not only that, the church is strong in Africa and parts of Asia and in Latin America, and there the people aren't into this capitalistic, they haven't arrived at the shopping culture. And in fact, that may be where the future of the Roman Catholic Church is, and it's better to play, to these people than the people who won't show up. You sing and dance for them and the whole thing, and they don't show up. So, but they told him, because you can't avoid life. Smile. By the way, it's very clear, he's an academician, he's not crazy about shaking hands. I mean, the previous quote about him, he was a perfect person for that. It's effortful for him. And they said, don't say provocative things. A period of calm, you understand, kiss children. And in fact, his first encyclical is rather interesting. It's about love. The first encyclical he issues is about love, and what he says is, love cannot tolerate promiscuity. Love is something that belongs to marriage. And therefore, love is transcendent. The whole thing about love, love, love. All right. Good, thank you. Then, he comes out with what he intends to do. Pope John Paul II brought down communism, or helped to. What's he going to do? Well, what he is going to do is bring the Catholics and Orthodox back together. How is he going to do that? Now he gets church. The head of the Orthodox Church lives where? In Istanbul, Constantinople. And so what he needs to do is go visit him, and he'll talk to Bartholomew, who is the patriarch of the Orthodox world, and maybe they can work out some way to bring them together. Now, I'm not talking about reconciliation with Protestants. The Orthodox, in terms of doctrine and the structure of the church, are very close to the Catholics. So they're conservative, and he sees the Catholic Church as conservative, and they should come together, and we can accomplish that. They've been hollering at each other, do you understand, for over 1,000 years. That'd be pretty good. And then he does something rather interesting. He announces that he's going to allow freely the use of the Latin Mass. Now, there was a group of people who left the church. They were ultra-conservative. They were infuriated that the Mass was now in English, French, Italian. The only legitimate Mass is one in Latin. So that's a very conservative position. He sort of announces that. He doesn't have what I would call a strategy for mobilizing the church. And then it appears. So I mention it because it's you would have to address yourself to a major anxiety of Catholics in Europe. Even the Catholics who don't show up for Mass anymore. What is their major anxiety? Well, over the last 2 decades in Europe, or 3 decades in Europe, there is one. A major issue. The major issue is that pouring into Europe are groups of people that are called Muslims. They come from Turkey, they come from Tunisia, they come from Algeria, they come from Morocco, whatever else it is. And they have a high birth rate. And first there are only 100 of them, and then there are 1,000 of them, then there are 100,000 of them, and then there are 5 million of them, you understand? And now in all of Europe, there are maybe 25 to 30 million of them. And they're growing fast. But there's nobody anymore listening to the Pope's directive about birth control. The Catholic population is what? The birth rate in Italy is 1%, and Spain is under 1%. Who can believe it? So now, lots of Catholics who don't go to Mass anymore. They're shopping, they're exercising, whatever. are concerned about these people coming in and taking over their neighborhoods with strange culture and people with women walking around with veils and head coverings and whatever. So now all of a sudden they feel very Western Christian against these things. Now, political parties have organized themselves all over Europe to kick the Muslims out. One of the issues that defeated the European Union Constitution in Holland and in France was the proposal to allow Turkey to join the Union. If Turkey joins the Union, it has 70 million people. Once they join the European Union, 35 million of them will be on their way to Paris. They'll just be on their way. Oh, what? In France, there is the National Front Party, Le Pen. In Germany, there are all these parties. In England, there are these parties. In Italy, there are the whole thing, the anti-Muslim parties. They are undermining our culture. What is our culture? Christian? Yes! Now, if you could mobilize people against Muslims, you would have an issue. You only have to visit in Europe to understand the intensity of Europe. Here, and in fact, that would be like the Crusade. The Pope, the leader of the Christian world, defending Christian Europe against the invasion of a foreign culture. Would that be possible? Could he deliberately choose that? Could he envision himself in that role? Well, if you want to find out, count that. Now, if you choose the Muslim issue as a way to mobilize, it's a very powerful issue. If you choose the Muslim issue as a way to mobilize, then you have to understand that most of the things that provoke the Muslims in Europe, which are the issues, their culture, most things that provoke them aren't Christian. They're post-Christian. They're part of the new secular culture that's in Europe. So Muslims are provoked by sexual liberation. Is sexual liberation Christian? Muslims are provoked by homosexuality. Is homosexuality Christian? So, in many respects, the ethics of Islam, of traditional Islam, and the ethics of traditional Catholicism are the what? Are the same. So, part of the problem is if you want to mobilize lots of people who have been secularized, who will answer, yes, I am Catholic, then you can't simultaneously feed them traditional Catholic doctrine because their lifestyle has radically changed. It's been secularized. You would have to make concessions to where they are, but it's very clear that the present Pope and the Pope that preceded him is not prepared to do that. Now, the preparation for engaging this issue was something that happened with regard to the European Union. The European Union wrote a constitution. And in the European Constitution, which hasn't been ratified because the Muslim issue, the Turkey issue, has prevented the ratification. But in the Constitution, no reference is made to God or Christianity. And in fact, many of the people who wrote it are so secularized that even if they said they were Catholic in a nominal sense, they're perfectly comfortable with that, in the same way that our Constitution has no reference to God or Christianity. Now, the great supporters of that idea were the French, including the president of France. His name is Chirac. So the Pope complained. He said, how can you have a constitution for Europe that doesn't refer to its historic culture? What made Europe Europe is its historic Christian culture. No reference to it. And if you want to keep the Turks out because they're Muslims, on what ground? If we're simply a secular state, then anybody can arrive in any number they want to, right? Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, whatever, just come on. So they have a high birth rate, we have a low birth rate, neighborhoods change. If indeed you want to defend the historic culture of Europe, then you better make reference to Christian culture. And if you make reference to Christian culture, you have to make reference to the church. Because what institution was it that defended Christian culture through all those years against Muslim invaders? You tell me. Pretty powerful. They didn't listen to him. I mean, Europe is hopelessly secular. I mean, the percentage of people in Europe who attend services in the Protestant world on a regular basis is under 7%. And who attend Mass regularly is somewhere between 10 to 15%. It makes American statistics look like we're the most religious country in the world. So no matter what has been done with Vatican Council II, it doesn't make any difference. Do you understand? So they're heavily secularized, so secularized that when they write a constitution, they don't even refer to the historic Christian culture of Europe. Well, then came the visit. One of the places he decided to go to visit, because after all, it's his native land. Wojtyła went back to Poland, where he was received by millions of people. Of course, they were trying to fight the communists and get rid of them, and he was viewed as the symbol of resistance, the whole thing. So now the place to go back to is Germany. So they get him ready, and he goes back to Germany. One of the places he wants to go back to, because he taught there and was the head of the school, is Regensburg. In fact, he has a brother who lives there, who's a priest too. None of the three children that his parents had got married. His brother became a priest, and his sister took care of him. She was with him all the time. She took care of him. She devoted herself to him. So he went back to Regensburg, and in Regensburg he gathers together a group of scholars whom he's known over the years to talk about religious issues. His favorite position is not media star. His favorite role is academician.
He's an academic. And he's used to giving academic lectures. He's written all these academic books on God and theology and religion and whatever. For him, and he says it, and he said it over and over again. John Paul II said it, and he said it. The chief enemy is secularism. Secularism is not hatred of the church. Secularism is indifference to the church. And secularists going around always talking about science and reason, implying in some way or other that the church isn't interested in science and reason. And I tell you, it is. But you have to have more, because science and reason can't give you morality. And that's what the church can add. Christianity is a religion of reason and faith. Reason enables us to relate effectively to the world, to temper our emotions, to prevent violence, and faith gives us the foundation of our morality. That was his general message, and he was going to give that message in Regensburg. That's one of his standard messages. So, and he, it's very interesting when he speaks. He says to the people, you have to understand that Christians are now a beleaguered minority. We're in a world that's so secular they can't even understand what our message is. So we have to mobilize, we have to unite. And in fact, you may discover you're not happy with your secular message. So now I have with me his speech in Regensburg, which caused, well, I had it. Oh, this is another piece of paper I was given. All right. Here we are. I'm not going to read this whole thing. I'm just going to read you the selection. And here he's talking to academics. Do you understand? He's not talking to a mob of people out there. He's talking in an academic tone. But he says something that's very interesting, which could be translated, if you wanted to a larger audience. In the seventh conversation, edited by Professor Khoury, of the erudite Byzantine emperor Manuel Palaeologus, and an educated Persian on the subject of Christianity and Islam, between 1394 and 1402, the Muslims besieged Constantinople. Inside of Constantinople is this man nobody's ever heard of other than the Pope. Others have. His name is Manuel Palaeologus. Palaeologus is the name of the imperial family. And Manuel is the emperor. And he's having a dialogue with a Muslim philosopher who happens to be Persian, all right, on the merits of Christianity and Islam. So this is during the time of war between the Christian world and the Muslim world. The Turks are at the gate of Constantinople, and Manuel is now having this learned debate with a Muslim philosopher. So, in the seventh conversation, the emperor touches on the theme of the Holy War. The emperor must have known that Surah 2 reads, "There is no compulsion in religion." According to the experts, this is one of the surahs, chapters of the early period in the Quran, when Muhammad was still powerless and under threat. But naturally, the emperor also knew the instructions developed later and recorded in the Quran concerning holy war. And without descending into details, such as the difference in treatment according to those who have the book and the infidels, he addresses his interlocutor with a startling brusqueness, a brusqueness which leaves us astounded on the central question about the relationship between religion and violence in general. And Manuel says, Show me just what Mohammed brought that was new. And there you will find things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached. The emperor is complaining to the Muslim philosopher. And what he's suggesting is, in the Quran, at the heart of Islam, is violence. Conversion by the sword. Oh. Now he's talking to a group of academics. Does he intend his words to be heard outside? Is he simply doing a kind of learned discourse on something and by accident says something that will infuriate the Muslim world? Well, so now let me go on to read after, the piece after it, because the quotation in the newspaper was always very short. The emperor, after having expressed himself so forcefully about Islam, goes on to explain in detail the reasons why spreading the faith through violence is something unreasonable. Violence is incompatible with the nature of God. God, he says, is not pleased by blood, and not acting reasonably is contrary to God's nature. God is by his nature reasonable. That's why he's the God of science. And that is why he is the God opposed to violence. So what he's saying is, in order for a religion to oppose violence, to be reasonable and moral, it must embrace reason. Now, here's the part that never made the newspaper. In all honesty, one must observe that in the late Middle Ages we find trends in theology which would sunder this marriage between the Greek spirit of reason and the Christian spirit. What he says is that Christianity is unique among the great religions because it married reason and faith. So, what about Islam? He goes on to explain here. In contrast with the so-called statements of Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, there arose a movement in Christianity which also denounced reason. And of course that led to Christian violence. But that was not authentically Christian. All right. Now he says, this gives rise to positions which clearly approach those of Ibn Hazm and might even lead to the image of a capricious God who was not even bound to truth and goodness. Ibn Hazm said, the nature of God, he's a Muslim philosopher, is not reason. God cannot be imprisoned. God says what God says, and if he says it, it must be what? Obeyed. Reasonable or not reasonable. So what he's saying is, in Christianity, there may be people who preach violence, but when they do, they're not Christian. Because at the heart of Christianity is what? Reason, and reason denounces violence. But in Islam, when they preach violence, they speak from the heart of Islam. Because at the heart of Islam is no reason. And therefore, God is arbitrary, and therefore God can endorse violence. To say this was an invidious comparison is first of all, I mean, even to maintain that all Christian violence isn't truly Christian, but all Muslim violence is truly Muslim. Now, when you make that statement, what are you saying? You are saying it is dangerous to admit Muslims into Europe. You know why? Because at the heart of their religion is violence. It's all right to keep the Christians because Christians, as you know, may become violent, but when they become violent, they're not Christians. Are you getting, are you hearing this? So, the question is, and I throw it out to you, when he gave this talk to the academics in Regensburg, was he simply giving some kind of idle philosophic speculation to a bunch of tired academics, imagining that nobody would remember what was said? Because you often go to these academic conferences, I say to them, so what do they say? No, so in which case it was innocuous, and when he apologized, he said, I had no intention to insult Islam. That wasn't my quote. I was quoting this emperor, this Byzantine emperor, Manuel. Shout at Manny. Don't shout at me. But he was quoting him, in a sense, in agreement. So, it was naive, to say the least. But you have to understand that he had already made a statement before he even became Pope that the European Union should not admit Turkey into the European Union because Europe has a Christian culture and it will be endangered by hordes of Muslims pouring into Europe. And this remark that was made in Regensburg was naively stated. He thought he was speaking to academics, but it was a continuing reflection of an image, of a strategy. And now he's trapped. He's going to visit Turkey because he wants to reconcile with the Orthodox Church. And in the interim, the whole Muslim world is what? Up in arms. You've insulted us. And there are liberal Catholics saying, how could you do it? We're trying to build up good relations with all the religions of the world. All this time invested since Vatican Council II in dialogue, and you're wrecking the whole thing? I mean, mobs were killing, they were attacking nuns or whatever, priests. But I do want to tell you, there were conservatives in the church and even people who weren't very Catholic who were saying, give it to him. Give it to him. I've heard expressions here because there's a great deal of anxiety in this country about the rising number of Muslims in North America. What does it mean ultimately for our society? So some people were saying, you know what? The Muslims may be angry, but he said the right thing. We've got too many of them. And if they come, their culture is opposed to our culture, whether it's Christian culture, secular Western culture, it doesn't make any difference. They're going to undermine it and wreck it. And in fact, that's what Europe needs to hear. And he had the courage to say it. So now he has two choices. One, he can say, you heard me. No. It would be very bold, but would give him a what? A strong position. He would be controversial, but it would give him what? A strong position. The other thing you can do is to say, I'm sorry I said it. I was wrong. He didn't do either. He showed up in Turkey. He was in Istanbul and Ankara. He went to visit the tomb of Kemal Atatürk, who hated all religions. Sorry, pay tribute to him. And his answer was, do you understand? If you didn't understand it, that's intended. No. You know, nobody can quite figure out what he's saying. Because he said, he didn't apologize for the statement. He apologized for the consequences of the statement. That's different. He didn't say, I'm wrong, right? The whole thing. He came and he said, I love Muslims. So, thank you. And he said, of course I want to continue dialogue. Of course I have said that the one true faith is the what? Is Roman Catholicism, and basically we have nothing to learn from you, but of course we want dialogue. And he did say, because he was asked the question, and I want you to know that I approve of Turkey entering the European Union. Now, is he serious? Did he just say it because he's in Turkey and wanted to mollify them? Because it did mollify them. That's the statement they needed to hear. If he said that and meant it, then his campaign to mobilize Europe against the Muslims, what? Christian Europe won't work. So he's in an unsatisfactory position. He's not clearly, do you understand, for dialogue, and he's not clearly for resistance. He's somewhere in this mushy world. So now let's look at the realities. The realities are the church is in Europe declining. He most likely will be the last pope who's chosen from Europe. The next pope may be chosen from Latin America or whatever else it is. The church is compromised by scandal. They have almost no priests, I mean, certainly in Europe and North America. It's highly unlikely the Orthodox will reconcile. The Russian Orthodox Church won't even let the Pope into Russia. So there's one issue. And the question is, given the complaint, is he going to drop the issue? See, that's the thing. Or, since the issue is a very powerful one, will he continue to use it? So now I'll make my prediction. All right, I could be wrong. No. My prediction is that he will continue to use it, because it's the one issue. If you want to mobilize people in Europe, and by the way, he believes in it sincerely, whatever there is of Christian culture in Europe will be totally undermined by hordes of Muslims pouring into that country, and he will have the courage to speak out, although quite frankly, instead of giving a clear answer, which would have been, yes, I said it, did you hear me? He backtracked, right? No full apology, but into what we call this mushy answer where you can't quite figure it out. Is he prepared to drop it I don't think it will be dropped because I want to tell you, in Europe over the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, the issue of the Muslim population is going to be overwhelmingly important and provocative. And the defense of European culture is going to be one of the important issues. And one of the ways the church can enter into the fray in a prominent way is to present itself as not the promoter of dialogue, but as the defender of Christian culture in Europe, again, against the Muslim invader. I don't think that statement was a mistake. I think it's a harbinger of things to come, and quite frankly, if he had the charisma and strength to do it, he could be a mobilizing figure in Europe. The test is he's 79 years old, and he sort of flunked the test in Turkey. And the question is whether he can revive the issue, but I'm telling you, there is no other issue that would mobilize, do you understand, the nominal members of his church more strongly in Europe than this issue. And there were people who said, give it to him. I don't think he will drop it. We will see. You've been a wonderful audience, and thank you for coming. department of the papal government that is supposed to conduct inquiries. No. Which means if you are suspected of harboring ideas that are considered to be not kosher, although that word is not used in papal circles, then you can be arrested and, if convicted, executed. So the penalties, by the way, the penalty of saying the wrong thing if your teacher doesn't like you in elementary school, so instead of getting an A, you get a C. And you complain to your mother. Okay, fine. But the penalty, do you understand, of uttering false doctrines is, in many cases, death. So you see the tightening of the ship. Do you get this? The ship is now tightening because that's what an enemy does. So now we have to create the fortress. And now we have to create a militant order of priests who will defend papal supremacy. And out of it comes an order that was founded in Spain. The order is called the Jesuits. And now the Jesuits will pass through the Catholic world. There had been before the Jesuits 2 preaching orders to reinforce the power of the Pope, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. But their power cannot equal the power of this new force, which now will sweep through all of Catholic Europe, creating universities and schools and recruiting thousands and thousands of priests to the order. They're called the what? The Jesuits. They are the army of the Pope. And now there is a very clear agenda. So the Protestant Reformation halted the decline because it mobilized the Pope and the Church to offer resistance. And out of it came an institution which many of us were familiar with when we were young. A church tightly controlled, very centralized, with great conformity in terms of doctrine. One of the successes of the Counter-Reformation was its ability to recruit thousands and thousands of people, men and women, to be priests and nuns, celibate people in the church. Celibacy was first enforced by the church in the 10th and 11th century. It applied only to the Western church because the Eastern church, the Greek church, allowed priests to get married. But by the time you get to the Counter-Reformation, the idea of totally giving and devoting your life to the church, the idea of a celibate priesthood is so intrinsically Catholic that people can't, do you understand, can't even conceive of the alternative. So, in the 17th century, the church is reborn. That is, the Protestant world actually is pushed back. In France, the Huguenots are first defeated and then they are expelled. And the church now finds allies. In the 17th century, its chief allies were a family called the Habsburgs, who ruled both southern Germany and Spain. And then in the 18th century, they find the Bourbons, the kings of France, who now become patrons of the church and of the Pope. And now there is an intense conformity that never had existed before. And in fact, the dream of Innocent III is reinforced. The Pope now has a force of supremacy that didn't exist before. The Renaissance has now transformed Rome itself into one of the most magnificent cities in Europe. And in fact, the papal palace will move from the Lateran Palace to another hill outside the city limits, across the Tiber River. It's called the Vatican Hill, and in fact, there will already have been erected the most magnificent church in the world. And the Pope is not simply the the chief clergyman, he is also the king of Rome. He owns Rome. Rome is part of his, what? It's territory he owns. It doesn't belong to Italy. It doesn't belong to Spain or France. It belongs to the Pope. It is a symbol of his power. Well, for the church, it seemed as though it had pulled itself together. But no sooner had it pulled itself together than there came the second assault. It was worse than the Protestant Reformation. Had it, by the way, not been for the Protestant Reformation, the church wouldn't have pulled itself, I mean, most likely would have just gradually sort of, sunk. It pulled itself together. It needed to be pulled together because now came an assault that was worse. We call it the age of science. It has many names. The Enlightenment, the age of science, the age of reason, the Industrial Revolution, the Urban Revolution, I don't care, whatever name you want to give it. Now, into Europe, there now comes this revolution which will change the minds and beliefs of the people in Western Europe. The Protestant Reformation said, it's important to be Christian, but we disagree with the church as to what it means to be a Christian. The Enlightenment produced a group of people who said, Christianity, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, it doesn't make any difference. I'm not interested. We call it secularization, right? It's a world in which people now move out of religion into what we call the secular world. Well, secularization now becomes the enemy. It's a worse enemy than Protestantism. If you're fighting an enemy that's religious, at least that enemy is saying it's important to be what? Religious. But if you're fighting an enemy that is secular, then the message of the enemy is, what are you all excited about? And in fact, as the age of science spreads, because science brings with it power, and as it's fueled also by the money of the new capitalist economy, there will emerge a new Western Europe in both the Protestant and the Catholic world, which will lower the importance of religion to people. So now the church, having pulled itself together against one danger, now finds itself, do you understand, facing an even greater danger. So at the leader of the church now is the Pope, because everything happens now, it's heavily centralized, right? What will the Pope do? Well, first, he almost has a nervous breakdown. I'll tell you why. In 1789 in France, there now comes a government to power called the French Revolution. The leaders of the French Revolution, they're not hostile to just Catholicism. They're not interested in religion. So they now separate religion from government, which means that the government that used to give, I don't know, millions and millions of livres to the church, no more, you're on your own. And not only that, they take education away from the church and create public schools. So how are we going to indoctrinate people? How are we going to teach people if we don't have what? If we don't have the schools to do it with? And then they produce a general whose name is Napoleon. And he goes down to Italy, and he conquers Italy, and he captures Rome. For those of you who went to see Tosca, you saw that. That's what the story of Tosca is about. Napoleon, the French, do you understand? The French are moving in on Rome, and the story of Tosca is about Scarpia, who is the agent of the Pope, who doesn't want Napoleon to take Rome. But the point is Napoleon takes it, and now the Pope, Pius VI, is a prisoner. I mean, it's one thing being a prisoner of Philippe le Bel. Philippe le Bel was a devout Catholic. Napoleon is the general of the revolution, like the Bolsheviks arrived. So Pius VI is followed by Pius VII, who also almost has a nervous breakdown. In fact, Napoleon now insists on becoming the emperor of France. He arranges for him and for Josephine to have a coronation. He orders the Pope to show up. The Pope has to travel. Napoleon doesn't go down to Rome the way Charlemagne did. Come to France, and at the ceremony, to show the contempt for the Pope, Napoleon takes the crown from Napoleon's hand and places it, Napoleon takes the crown from the Pope's hand and places it on his own head. Humiliation? So now, having just pulled itself together against the Protestants, this new enemy, called the secular enemy, shows up. Well, the best thing, obviously, for the Pope was that Napoleon overreached and got defeated. And having been defeated, the Church now begins to recover. But the popes were very burned by the French Revolution. They hated it. They were humiliated by it. And so in the 19th century, the response to this revolution, which doesn't stop, is to fight it. It's called the resistance. First comes Pope Gregory the 16th. Don't say the word Napoleon to him. He breaks out in a rash. And then, after Gregory the 16th, comes the man who most likely had the longest reign as a pope. His name is, they've revived this name that was used very early in the history of the church and then was forgotten and now revived. It's Pius, spelled P-I-U-S, and this is now Pius the Ninth. And Pius the Ninth will come to power somewhere around 1846, and he will stay in power until 1878. That's about 32 years. And Pius hates the age of science, and he hates the French Revolution. And now there are all these issues that the secular world brings. Freedom for the individual. Democracy. Feminism. Evolution. You have to understand that only 13 years after he came to power, Charles Darwin publishes the what? The origin. This thing is relentless. Well, Pius IX has a very clear idea. Pius IX is a very interesting pope. There were Jews living in Rome, and in fact, there's a famous case called the Mortara case. During his reign, the Catholic maid of one of the Jewish households, secretly baptizes one of the children. And then she takes the child to the priest. And the parents miss the child, and they go to claim it, and the priest will not give it back because the child has been baptized and is no longer Jewish. So it finally gets up to the Pope, and the Pope supports the priest, who supports the maid, whatever else. It's the famous Mortara. I'm trying to give you an idea of the conservatism of this. Do you understand? Most of Europe was absolutely outraged by now. Do you understand? We've reached the age of personal freedom, democracy, whatever. How can this happen? Well, this Pope publishes a syllabus of errors. Syllabus of errors means ideas that no good Catholic may publicly entertain. Personal freedom, democracy, liberalism, modernism, whatever else it is. By this time, by the way, the church has not yet recognized that Galileo was right. Even in the central Samoa Islands they have. That the earth goes around the sun has not yet been formally acknowledged. You got this mood here? Resistance. So the final thing is the French first support the Italians in uniting Italy, but the Italians lack one city that they want, Rome, which is in the hands of the Pope. They're forced to use Florence, not a bad choice. They're forced to use Florence as the capital of Italy. But now in 1870, the French are defeated by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War, and in fact, the French who were protecting the Pope against the Italians now withdraw, and the Italian army marches into Rome. Just before it does, Pius IX calls the Great Council. It's called Vatican Council I. This is the call of defiance. At that Vatican Council, a doctrine is approved, which is controversial, that the Pope is infallible. This is 1870. When he speaks ex cathedra from his throne on matters of doctrine, he makes absolutely no mistake. And as he's issuing the rule, the Italian army is marching into Rome. To express their defiance of the Pope, the first mayor of Rome they elect is Jewish. Okay. So now the Pope is a prisoner, do you understand, in the Vatican. He will not talk to the Italian government, not even about plumbing, sewage, nothing. No conversation until 1929. The popes make this decision, not to accommodate themselves, but to offer what? Resistance. In 1878, Pius IX is followed by somebody who's a little less militant, Leo XIII. Leo XIII continues the line of Pius IX. He modifies it by issuing a proclamation denouncing the ills of capitalism. Because from the papal point of view, the new economy is as evil, do you understand, as the new science. And then, at the beginning of the 20th century, appears Pius X, who is as conservative as Pius IX. He issues a long list of things you can't believe, or meaning you can't say you believe. And then Pius X is followed by the man after whom the new pope named himself, Benedict XV, who's all caught up in World War I, so he doesn't have much time to deal with the issues of the church. And then, in the early 1920s, appears the pope that I remember first in my childhood. He reigned until 1939. His name was Pius XI. His real name was Ratti, R-A-T-T-I, and he was a very, very smart guy, and he's the one who now does something that will be very important. By the 1920s, the church is confronted by another enemy. I mean, it doesn't stop. The enemy started in October 1917. It's called the Bolshevik Revolution. So now there are the commies. And the commies are militantly atheistic, are they not? And in fact, the Roman Catholic Church is viewed as what? The enemy, and if they should ever get in charge, they would tear it down brick by brick, the way Stalin had dismantled the Russian Orthodox Church. So now what do? Well, the most powerful force fighting communism in Europe is a new political force called fascism, which in 1922 takes over Italy with a man called Benito Mussolini. So now the church hates communism. Can it support fascism? Well, Mussolini is fighting communism, so the principle is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And in 1929, having refused to talk with the Italian government, do you understand, for 58 years about the plumbing or the streets or whatever, the Pope, who is really a prisoner in the Vatican because he does not recognize that the Italian government has the right to Rome, now makes a deal called the Concordat of 1929 with Mussolini, in which the Italian government now recognizes Catholicism as the official religion of the state, will offer funds, will have teaching of Catholicism in the fascist schools of the state. Got this marriage, and in fact the justification for it is that the fascists, including Mussolini, stand firmly against the commies. But then the problem comes. Hitler takes over in Germany. In Germany, it's not just the hating the commies. German fascism adds something that Italian fascism didn't have: anti-Semitism. So now what happens? Well, the Secretary of State of Pius XI is a man very thin. I don't know how he got so thin. I struggle, but it is just thin, thin, thin. His name is Pacelli. He comes from a fairly well-off, semi-noble Italian family, and he has been to Germany many times. He now becomes the agent of Pius XI, and in fact, a deal is now made with Hitler, because the Catholics in Germany are annoyed over the fact that the Nazis want to take over education from the Catholics. What about Catholic instruction? So now Pacelli engineers this. Very austere man. Some people think his austerity signifies saintliness, and some people think his austerity signifies something sinister, but whatever it is. In 1939, when Pius XI dies, and I'm 11 years old, they elect a new pope. And the man they elect is Pacelli, who now becomes the famous Pius XII. And in fact, when he is elected pope, he's elected pope just as the Second World War begins. And Pius XII, obviously, this is all part of what we call the resistance. First there are the Protestants, then there are the what? The secularists, and now there are the commies. The church has to be kept what? Like a fortress, tight. And we sometimes have to make deals that are problematic. In World War II, there were many outrages performed by the Nazi regime. During World War II, Pius XII said virtually nothing about what the Nazis were doing in Germany, including the Holocaust of 6 million Jews. I do want you to know that John Paul II has recommended before he died, Pius XII to be designated a saint. Pius XII would reign until 1958, and in fact, his choice seemed to be vindicated because after World War II, the Nazis ceased to be the enemy of the United States of America, and the commies became the enemy. And was he not the person who had told them in the first place that the enemy was the commies? Under Pius XII, the Counter-Reformation, do you understand? Tight! But already, and this is how I'm going to conclude, will lead to the next. Already, there's a problem. Following World War II, prosperity comes to Western Europe. Within 10 to 15 years, you understand there's a transformation in Germany, which will spread to France and to Italy. It takes a while to get to England. And there's a principle. The more poverty, the more religious people are. The less poverty, the what? The less religious people are. The less urbanized people are, the more religious they are. The more urbanized they are, the less religious. I mean, this is the whole thing. So now, Western Europe, the cities are growing, the economy is expanding, and now the consumer culture has arrived in Western Europe. And once the consumer culture arrives, you have to understand, it's not simply secularism or the communists or the Protestants. What now happens to life, we all know it, is options. I'd love to go to church, but I got golf, shopping. I mean, it's called options. And it isn't that somebody just deliberately denounces the church. We all have priority lists, right? So we move it from priority number 1 to priority number 12, and you never tend to it because you never get to 12. Does that mean you don't like 12? I talk to people often. Their parents complain that their children never come to see them, and the children say, well, we love our parents. They do. It's just that their parents are number 13. No, you understand? It isn't that they don't love them. It's just they love it all. And they're just number 13 on their prayer. That's the consumer culture. Options. So now what is being discovered toward the end of the reign of Pius XII is that a new enemy has arrived. It's called the consumer culture, and what it does is it simply takes people away from religious activity because there are other things more interesting for them to pursue, and one of the things the consumer culture promises you, that if you behave, if you diet, and have the right doctor, you may live forever. So now, instead of listening to the church, do you understand? You're reading the magazines, you're reading the newspaper, you're getting the latest information, how to pull it up, how to pull it in, how to last forever here on earth, the whole thing. I mean, it is and I want to tell you this, the most formidable enemy the Pope has encountered is not the Protestants. And it's not the secularization process. And it's not the commies, because the commies have fallen. It doesn't make any difference. It's called this force that has enveloped all of us. Do you understand? It's called the consumer culture. So the question is, how will the church respond to this challenge? Enter John Paul II and the Vatican Council II. That's for next week. I hope you'll join me for all of that. Thank you very much.